The school bus driver waited an extra 5 minutes every single morning. Not because he had to, not because anyone asked him to, but because he knew that little boy needed those 5 minutes. You see, Marcus wasn't like the other kids. His shoes were always untied. His backpack hung loose on one shoulder. And every morning, without fail, he came running down that street exactly 5 minutes after everyone else had already boarded. The other drivers would have left him behind. Company policy said wait 2 minutes, maximum. But Frank saw something in that kid's eyes that made him grip the steering wheel a little tighter and wait just a little longer. What would you do? Would you risk your job for a child you barely knew? Would you bend the rules when no one was watching? Every morning, Frank watched that same scene unfold. The boy's father would stumble out of their apartment, still in yesterday's clothes. He'd wave frantically at the bus, mouthing "thank you" through the windshield while trying to tie his son's shoes on the doorstep. It was chaos. It was heartbreaking. And it was becoming Frank's daily routine. The other kids on the bus started to notice. They'd roll their eyes. They'd complain about being late. Some would even mock Marcus when he finally climbed aboard, out of breath and apologizing. But Frank would look in that rearview mirror and give the boy a small nod. Just a simple gesture. That said, "You're okay, kid. You made it." You know what's interesting about small acts of kindness? They're like stones thrown into still water. The ripples spread in ways you never expect. Frank thought he was just helping one kid catch the bus. He had no idea what was really happening in that apartment. He had no idea why those 5 minutes mattered so much. Marcus would always sit in the same seat. Third row back, left side, right behind Mrs. Chen's daughter. He'd pull out a crumpled piece of paper and start doing homework he obviously hadn't finished the night before. His pencil would scratch frantically across the page while the bus rumbled through the morning streets. Sometimes Frank would catch glimpses of the boy in his mirror. The way his shoulders hunched forward. The way he'd stare out the window when they passed the hospital. The way he'd clutch that backpack like it contained everything he owned in the world. There's something about driving the same route every day that makes you notice the small things. The way certain houses always have their lights on. The way certain corners always have the same people waiting. The way certain kids always sit in certain seats, but Marcus was different. Every day with Marcus felt like Frank was holding his breath, waiting for something to break. 3 months. That's how long Frank had been waiting those extra 5 minutes. 3 months of watching that father struggle. 3 months of seeing that boy run. 3 months of bending rules that could cost him everything. You might think it's just 5 minutes. What's the big deal? But when you're responsible for 40 other kids, when you have a schedule to keep, when your supervisor is breathing down your neck about punctuality, those 5 minutes become an eternity. They become a choice. They become a statement about who you are when no one's keeping score. Frank had been driving school buses for 23 years. He'd seen it all. The fighters, the criers, the ones who threw up on field trip days, the ones who forgot their lunch money, the ones who got picked up by different parents on different days because of custody battles. But something about Marcus hit different. Maybe it was the way the boy never complained, never made excuses, just ran harder, breathed heavier, and always said thank you when he climbed those steps. Or maybe it was the way his father looked, that haunted expression, those dark circles under his eyes, that trembling hand when he waved goodbye. The truth has a way of revealing itself in fragments, like pieces of a puzzle scattered across time. Frank started noticing things. The medical bracelet on the father's wrist, the pharmacy bags, the way Marcus would sometimes have a different adult dropping him off, always looking worried, always in a hurry. What do you do when you realize someone's drowning but they haven't asked for help? What do you do when you see a family barely holding on by a thread? Most people would mind their own business. Most people would follow the rules. Most people aren't Frank. One particularly cold morning, Frank watched Marcus run out without a jacket. The boy's father tried to chase after him but stumbled on the steps, fell hard. Frank could see him struggling to get up, could see Marcus torn between getting on the bus and going back to help. The boy's eyes met Frank's in the mirror. Just for a second. Just long enough for Frank to nod and say, "Go ahead, son. I'll wait." Those 5 minutes turned into 10 that day. Marcus helped his father back inside, grabbed his jacket, and ran back out. When he finally boarded, his eyes were red. His hands were shaking. But he still said thank you. He still found his seat. He still pulled out his homework. The other kids were getting restless. Some parents had started calling the school. Why is the bus always late? Why can't the driver keep to the schedule? My child is missing valuable instruction time. Frank knew he was walking a tightrope, but every time he thought about leaving on time, he'd remember that look in Marcus's eyes. You see, kindness isn't always convenient. It isn't always easy. Sometimes kindness means risking something. Sometimes it means standing in the gap between someone's struggle and their breaking point. Sometimes it means being the only stable thing in someone's chaotic world. Frank had no idea that his 5 minutes were the difference between Marcus making it to school and Marcus giving up entirely. He had no idea that those moments of patience were teaching that boy something about human decency that no textbook could ever convey. He had no idea that somewhere, in an apartment filled with medical equipment and uncertainty, a father was praying for just one more day of strength. The breaking point came on a Tuesday. Isn't it funny how life's biggest moments never happen when you expect them? They don't wait for perfect weather or convenient timing. They just crash into your ordinary Tuesday like a wave you didn't see coming. Frank pulled up to Marcus's stop at exactly 7:47 a.m., just like always. He put the bus in park. He turned on the flashers. He waited. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes. The kids behind him started their usual complaints, but something felt different this morning. The air itself seemed heavier. 4 minutes, 5 minutes, 6 minutes, still no Marcus. Frank's hand hovered over the gear shift. Company policy screamed in his head. The schedule demanded he move on, but that thing in his gut, that human thing, that recognizes when something's wrong, it wouldn't let him drive away. Have you ever had that feeling? That moment when you know you're standing at a crossroads between what's easy and what's right. Frank had been at that crossroads every morning for 3 months. But this morning, it felt like the universe was holding its breath. 7 minutes, 8 minutes. Finally, Frank made a decision that would change everything. He engaged the parking brake. He stood up from his driver's seat. He looked at the bus full of kids and said something he'd never said before. "I'll be right back." The short walk to Marcus's apartment felt like crossing a bridge between two worlds. The world of rules and schedules and policies, and the world of human need and suffering and grace. Frank's heavy boots echoed on the concrete steps. His hand hesitated before knocking on the door. What he saw when that door opened would stay with him forever. Marcus's father collapsed on the floor, Marcus trying desperately to lift him. And in the background, the steady beep of medical machines and the smell of a crisis unfolding. "He won't wake up," Marcus said, his voice barely a whisper. "I tried to get him up like always, but he won't wake up." The boy's school uniform was wrinkled. His homework was scattered on the floor. His whole world was coming apart at the seams. You know what's remarkable about humans? In our darkest moments, we reveal who we truly are. Frank didn't hesitate, didn't calculate the consequences, didn't worry about the 40 kids sitting on his bus. He pulled out his phone, called 911, and knelt beside that father, checking for a pulse while trying to keep Marcus calm. The paramedics arrived in minutes that felt like hours. They worked with practiced efficiency, stabilizing Marcus's father, preparing him for transport. And through it all, Frank kept one hand on Marcus's shoulder, a steady presence in the chaos, an anchor in the storm. "Is he going to be okay?" Marcus asked, his voice breaking. "He has to be okay, he's all I have." And that's when the pieces finally clicked for Frank. The morning struggles, the medical equipment, the exhaustion. This wasn't just a disorganized family. This was a father fighting a battle with his own body while trying to raise his son alone. As they loaded his father into the ambulance, Marcus looked lost. Where would he go? Who would take care of him? The paramedics were asking about family, about emergency contacts, and the boy just stood there, drowning in a moment too big for his small shoulders to carry. "You're coming with me," Frank said, and those 4 words changed the trajectory of 2 lives forever. Sometimes courage looks like a school bus driver making a split-second decision. Sometimes love looks like breaking protocol to protect a child who has nowhere else to turn. Frank radioed the school, explained the situation, told them to send another driver for the route. His supervisor's voice crackled through the speaker, listing policies and procedures and liability concerns. But Frank had already made his choice. Some things matter more than rules. Some moments demand we rise above our job descriptions. You want to know what Marcus did during that ambulance ride? He held his father's hand and talked about school, about his science project on butterflies, about how he'd learned to tie his shoes faster, about how the bus driver always waited for him. His father's eyes flickered open just once, just long enough to whisper, "Thank you for waiting." The hospital waiting room became their temporary home for the next 6 hours. Frank called the school again, this time to explain he wouldn't be returning at all that day. Marcus sat beside him, still clutching his backpack, still wearing his school uniform that now seemed so irrelevant. "Why did you wait for me?" Marcus asked suddenly. "Every day, even when the other kids complained, even when you could have gotten in trouble, why did you wait?" The question hung in the antiseptic air between them. How do you explain human decency to a child who's seen so little of it? Frank thought for a moment. "Because," he said finally, "sometimes the most important thing we can do is give someone else a little more time. Sometimes 5 minutes can make all the difference in the world." What happened next was one of those moments that reminds you why people matter more than policies. The doctor emerged with news. Marcus's father had suffered a severe diabetic episode. He'd been managing his condition alone, working nights, sleeping too little, eating poorly, all while trying to be everything for his son. The stress had finally caught up. He would recover. But it would take time. And that raised the question nobody wanted to ask. What would happen to Marcus? The social worker arrived with forms and protocols. Foster care was mentioned. Emergency placement. Temporary solutions that felt anything but temporary to a boy who just wanted his dad. You know what's interesting about defining moments? They rarely announce themselves. They don't come with warning labels or instruction manuals. They just arrive, demanding you choose who you're going to be. Frank looked at that social worker, looked at Marcus, looked at the stack of forms that would scatter this boy's life to the wind. "He's staying with me," Frank said. "Until his father is better, he's staying with me." The social worker launched into explanations about background checks and proper procedures and approved foster families. But Frank had already pulled out his phone, calling his wife, explaining the situation, asking her to prepare their spare room. Sometimes love looks like a bus driver who waited 5 extra minutes. Sometimes, family forms in hospital waiting rooms. Sometimes the most profound connections are forged not by blood, but by choice, by showing up, by refusing to leave. Marcus's father would spend 2 weeks in the hospital, 2 weeks of Frank driving him to visit every day after school, 2 weeks of homework at kitchen tables and bedtime stories from a man who'd never had kids of his own. 2 weeks that would redefine what both of them understood about family. Living with Frank and his wife Helen was like stepping into a different universe for Marcus. You ever notice how some houses just feel like homes the moment you walk in? The Johnsons' house was like that. Warm lights, the smell of actual cooking, photos on the walls of people who smiled like they meant it. That first night, Marcus sat at their dinner table, unsure what to do with himself. He'd been living on cereal and microwave dinners for so long he'd forgotten what a real meal looked like. Helen had made pot roast, mashed potatoes, green beans, the kind of meal that says you matter without using words. "You don't have to do this," Marcus said quietly, pushing his food around his plate. "I can take care of myself. I've been doing it for a while now." The words hung heavy in the air. What kind of world makes a child feel guilty for needing help? Frank and Helen exchanged a look. 25 years of marriage creates its own language. Without speaking, they agreed. This boy needed more than food and shelter. He needed to remember what it felt like to be a kid, to be cared for, to not carry the weight of the world on his small shoulders. You know what's beautiful about kindness? It's contagious. The next morning, when Frank drove his route, something had changed. Word had spread about what happened, about where Marcus was staying, about why Frank had broken all those rules. And instead of anger or resentment, something else emerged. Mrs. Chen's daughter moved over so Marcus could sit next to her. The Wilson twins shared their snacks with him. Even Tommy Martinez, the kid who usually caused trouble in the back, gave Marcus a nod of respect. They all knew. They all understood. Sometimes breaking the rules is the most honorable thing you can do. But it was what happened after school that truly showed the power of community. Parents started showing up at Frank's house, not to complain, not to criticize, but to help. They brought casseroles. They offered to drive Marcus to the hospital. They asked what else they could do. One mother, whose son had been one of the loudest complainers about the late bus, stood on Frank's porch with tears in her eyes. "I'm so ashamed," she said. "I taught my son that being on time was more important than being human. Thank you for showing us what really matters." The hospital visits became a ritual. Every day after school, Frank would drive Marcus to see his father. They'd play cards, share stories about the day. Marcus would update him on homework and friends and how he was getting faster at tying his shoes. His father would listen, getting stronger each day, grateful beyond words for the man who'd saved them both. "I don't know how to repay you," Marcus's father said one evening, his voice still weak but his eyes clear. "You didn't just save my life, you saved my son's future. How do I thank someone for that?" Frank shook his head. "You don't repay kindness," he said. "You pass it on. Someday, somewhere, someone else is going to need 5 extra minutes, and when that happens, you give it to them. That's how you repay it." What Marcus didn't know was that Frank had been writing letters, talking to school administrators, meeting with social services, fighting battles behind the scenes to make sure this boy's life wouldn't be derailed by circumstance. Because that's what love does. It fights for people who can't fight for themselves. 2 weeks can feel like a lifetime when you're watching someone you love fight for their health. But it can also feel like a blink when you're discovering what family really means. For Marcus, those 2 weeks with the Johnsons rewired everything he thought he knew about how the world worked. Helen taught him things his father had been too sick to manage: how to iron his school uniform, how to pack a lunch that wouldn't spoil by noon, how to set an alarm clock and actually wake up to it. Small things, ordinary things, things that felt like miracles to a boy who'd been drowning in chaos. But it was the evenings that changed him most. You see, Frank and Helen had a routine. After dinner, they'd sit in the living room. Frank would read the newspaper. Helen would work on her crossword puzzles. And they'd talk, not about anything important, just talk. About their days, about the weather, about nothing and everything. Marcus had never experienced this. In his world, evenings meant homework alone while his father slept off his exhaustion. It meant the sound of medical equipment and the weight of worry. But here, evenings meant belonging. They meant Frank helping with math problems and Helen making hot chocolate and everyone pretending not to notice when Marcus fell asleep on the couch, safe and warm and home. "Can I ask you something?" Marcus said one night, fighting sleep. "Why don't you have kids of your own?" The question landed softly in the lamplit room. Frank and Helen exchanged another one of those married couple looks, a whole conversation in a glance. "We tried," Helen said gently. "For years we tried, but sometimes life has different plans." She paused, looking at this boy who'd crashed into their lives like a comet. "Maybe we were just waiting for you to need us. You ever think about how life works? How sometimes the thing you think is your greatest loss becomes the space for your greatest gift?" Frank and Helen had mourned their childlessness for years. But if they'd had children of their own, would they have had room in their lives for Marcus when he needed them most? The day Marcus's father was released from the hospital was bittersweet. Of course Marcus was thrilled. Of course he wanted his dad back. But leaving the Johnsons' house felt like leaving a piece of himself behind. How do you say goodbye to people who showed you what stability feels like? How do you thank someone for giving you a glimpse of normal? This isn't goodbye, Frank said firmly, loading Marcus's things into his truck. This is just, see you later. You're stuck with us now, kid. Helen's already planning Sunday dinners. I've got a list of homework help sessions. And that bus? It's still going to wait for you every morning, but maybe now you won't need those 5 minutes. The reunion between Marcus and his father was everything you'd expect. Tears, promises, apologies that weren't necessary but needed to be said anyway. But there was something different now. Something had shifted in their small apartment. It wasn't just the new medication schedule taped to the refrigerator or the meal prep containers Helen had stocked their freezer with. It was hope. For the first time in longer than either of them could remember, they had hope. And backup. And people who cared. And a bus driver who taught them that sometimes the most radical thing you can do is simply refuse to leave someone behind. Marcus's father stood at the window that night watching Frank's truck disappear down the street. His son was already asleep, exhausted from the emotion of the day. And in the quiet of their apartment, with the medical equipment humming its familiar tune, he whispered a prayer of gratitude for a man who waited 5 minutes. The next Monday morning arrived with a plot twist nobody saw coming. Marcus was ready 15 minutes early. His shoes were tied. His backpack was organized. His homework was not just done, but double-checked. He stood at the bus stop, waiting for Frank, practically vibrating with an energy his father hadn't seen in years. When the bus rounded the corner exactly on time, Frank did a double take. There was Marcus standing tall, wearing a smile that could have powered the whole city. And beside him, his father. Not in yesterday's clothes, not struggling, but standing strong, holding a large envelope in his hands. "Mr. Frank," Marcus's father called out as the bus doors opened. "Could I have just 1 minute of your time? I promise I won't make you late." The other kids on the bus leaned forward, curious. Even they could sense something important was happening. You want to know what changes lives? It's not always the big gestures. Sometimes it's the accumulation of small acts of kindness that suddenly crystallize into something larger. Marcus's father climbed onto the bus, something he'd never done before. He looked at the 40 faces staring back at him. He cleared his throat. "I want you all to know something," he began, his voice steady but emotional. "This man, your bus driver, saved my son's life, and mine. Not with medicine or money, but with 5 minutes. Every day he waited 5 minutes. He broke rules for us. He risked his job for us, and when I couldn't be there for my son, he was." The bus was silent. Even Tommy Martinez, who usually couldn't sit still for 30 seconds, was frozen in place. Marcus's father continued, "I've been sick, I'm getting better now. But during my worst days, knowing that someone cared enough to wait for my boy, it kept me fighting. It kept me believing that the world had good people in it." He turned to Frank and handed him the envelope. "This is from all of us, the parents, the ones who complained about the late bus, the ones who didn't understand. We took up a collection. It's not much, but we wanted to do something to show you that kindness doesn't go unnoticed, even when we're too busy or too selfish to see it at first." Frank's hands shook as he opened the envelope. Inside was a check, yes, but more importantly, there were letters. Dozens of them. From parents, from kids, from people who'd heard the story. Letters thanking him for showing them what really mattered. Letters promising to pay it forward. Letters that prove that one person's compassion can ripple out in ways we never imagine. "I can't accept this," Frank started to say, but Marcus's father stopped him. "You can, and you will. Because this isn't charity. This is community. This is what happens when someone shows us how to be better. You waited for my son. Now let us do something for you." What happened next was one of those moments that restores your faith in humanity. The kids on the bus started clapping, slowly at first, then building to a crescendo. 40 kids, aged 5 to 15, united in recognizing that they'd witnessed something special, that their grumpy morning bus driver was actually a hero in disguise. Marcus climbed onto the bus, but this time he didn't hurry to his usual seat. He stopped beside Frank and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Thank you for waiting for me. Thank you for everything." Then he did something that made even the toughest kids tear up. He hugged Frank. Right there in front of everyone. You know what's amazing about transformation? It's contagious. Over the next few weeks, something shifted on bus number 47. Kids started looking out for each other. They saved seats for classmates who were running late. They shared snacks with those who forgot lunch money. They turned from 40 individuals into a community, all because one man showed them what it looked like to care. 6 months later, the local news picked up the story. How does word spread about a bus driver who changed lives with 5 minutes? In an age of social media and viral videos, sometimes the most powerful stories are still shared the old-fashioned way. Person to person, heart to heart, until someone finally says, "This needs to be told." The reporter showed up on a Tuesday morning, camera crew in tow, expecting a simple human interest piece. What she found was a revolution of kindness. Not just Frank's story, but the ripple effects. The way the entire bus route had transformed. The way parents now waved from their doorsteps. The way kids helped each other with homework while waiting. At stops. "I just waited 5 minutes," Frank told the reporter, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. That's all. Anyone would have done the same. But that's where he was wrong. Not everyone would have done the same. Most people follow the rules. Most people protect themselves. Most people don't risk their livelihood for a child they barely know. Marcus's father agreed to be interviewed, and his words would later become the quote that made the story go viral. "We live in a world that tells us to hurry, to achieve, to never be late. But Frank taught us that sometimes the most important thing you can do is slow down, to wait, to see the human being in front of you who needs just a little more time." What the cameras captured that day was more than a feel-good story. They captured a community transformed. They interviewed Mrs. Chen, who talked about how her daughter had started a homework club on the bus. They interviewed the Wilson twins' mother, who'd organized a meal train for 3 other struggling families. They interviewed Tommy Martinez, who proudly showed off his bus helper badge, a role Frank had created to channel his energy positively. You want to know what made the biggest impact? It wasn't the donations that poured in after the story aired. It wasn't the recognition from the school board or the commendation from the mayor. It was the letters from other bus drivers, from teachers, from people across the country who watched the story and decided to wait their own 5 minutes. A bus driver in Detroit wrote, "I saw your story. This morning I waited for a girl who's always late. Turns out her mom works 3 jobs. Those 5 minutes matter. Thank you for reminding me." A teacher in Phoenix shared, "I used to mark kids tardy without thinking. Now I ask why. You'd be amazed what you learn when you pause to care." The school district faced a choice. They could have used Frank's story as a cautionary tale about following procedures. Instead, they did something remarkable. They implemented the 5-minute rule, a district-wide policy that gave drivers discretion to wait when they sensed a child needed it. They turned one man's compassion into systemic change. But the most beautiful part? Marcus, the boy who once ran for the bus every morning, was now student council president. His campaign promise? To make sure no kid ever felt alone or left behind. He organized study groups. He started a peer mentoring program. He became the person he'd needed when he was struggling. "Mr. Frank taught me something?" Marcus said at a school assembly, his father watching proudly from the audience. "He taught me that heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear bus driver uniforms. Sometimes they just wait 5 minutes. And sometimes that's enough to change everything." The ripples kept spreading. Frank and Helen officially became Marcus's godparents. Sunday dinners became a tradition. The spare room in their house became a study space for any kid who needed a quiet place to do homework. Their home became a hub of community care, all because of 5 minutes. A year passed. Then 2. Time has a way of testing whether change is real or just temporary emotion. But on bus number 47, the transformation held. In fact, it deepened. What started as one man's kindness had evolved into a movement that nobody could have predicted. Tianka school district started tracking something interesting. Attendance rates on Frank's route were the highest in the city. Test scores were improving. Behavioral incidents were down. Social workers reported fewer crisis interventions. Administrators scratched their heads trying to understand what was different about this particular bus route. You know what they found? Community. Real, authentic, messy, beautiful community. Kids who looked out for each other. Parents who communicated. A bus driver who knew every child's name, their struggles, their dreams. It wasn't complicated, it was just human connection. But in a world that often forgets the power of simply showing up for each other, it was revolutionary. Marcus was in high school now, taller, more confident, but still carrying that same backpack. He'd developed a morning routine with his father. They'd wake up early, have breakfast together, check his dad's blood sugar, and walk to the bus stop side by side. Those 5 minutes of panic had been replaced by 5 minutes of peace. I got into the mentorship program, Marcus announced one morning, waving an acceptance letter. It was a competitive program that paired high school students with elementary kids who needed support. I wrote my essay about you, he told Frank. About how one person believing in you can change your whole life. Frank's eyes misted over. He'd been driving buses for 25 years now, but these moments still got him. Proud of you, kid, he said, his voice rough with emotion. You're going to change lives. Marcus grinned. Learned from the best. What Marcus didn't know was that Frank had been battling his own health issues. High blood pressure. Stress from years of early mornings and difficult routes. His doctor had been pushing him to retire, to take it easy. But how do you walk away from something that's become more than a job? How do you leave when you know you're making a difference? Helen noticed him struggling more. Saw him wince when he climbed into the driver's seat. Watched him take longer to recover after each route. You can't do this forever, she said gently one evening. Maybe it's time to think about what comes next. But what came next arrived in an unexpected form. The phone rang on a Thursday evening. The school superintendent was on the line. Not with a complaint or a concern, but with an offer. Frank, she said, we've been watching what you've built. We want to replicate it. Would you consider a new role? Training drivers. Sharing your approach. Helping us build this kind of community on every route. You ever have one of those moments where life offers you exactly what you need, right when you need it? Frank looked at Helen, saw her encouraging nod, and felt something shift inside him. Maybe his body was telling him it was time to step back from daily driving. But his heart had more to give. One condition, Frank said. I keep driving my morning route. Maybe not every day, but enough to stay connected. Those kids, those families, they're not just passengers, they're my people. The superintendent laughed. I wouldn't expect anything else. Welcome to your next chapter, Frank. The announcement of Frank's new role brought mixed emotions to Bus 47. Kids worried about who would replace him. Parents wondered if the magic would disappear. But Frank had a plan. He'd been training Marcus's father, who'd been volunteering as a bus aide since recovering. Who better to carry on the tradition than someone who understood firsthand the power of 5 minutes? The transition was seamless in a way that surprised everyone. Marcus's father, David, took over the daily driving while Frank rode along 3 days a week, mentoring and supporting. It was like watching a legacy being passed from one generation to the next, built on shared understanding of what really mattered. David brought his own gifts to the role. He understood struggle in ways Frank couldn't. He recognized the signs of families in crisis. He knew which kids were carrying too much weight. And he had a gentle way of creating space for kids to just be kids, even if only for the duration of a bus ride. You saved my life, David told Frank one morning as they prepared the route. Now let me help save others. And he did. He noticed which kids came to school hungry and started keeping granola bars in a basket by his seat. He learned which parents worked night shifts and made sure those kids knew they could sleep a few extra minutes on the bus. The ripple effects continued to spread in ways nobody could have predicted. The local news story had been picked up nationally, then internationally. Letters poured in from around the world. Bus drivers in Japan, teachers in Finland, parents in Brazil, all sharing how Frank's story had inspired them to slow down, to notice, to wait. A nonprofit organization reached out, wanting to create a curriculum based on Frank's approach. They called it the 5-minute principle, the idea that small acts of patience and kindness could transform communities. They offered to pay Frank to develop the program, to travel and speak, but Frank had a different idea. Marcus should be part of this, he insisted, and David, and Helen, and all the families who've lived this story. This isn't about me, it's about us. It's about what happens when we choose to see each other as human beings instead of obstacles to our schedule. You know what's beautiful about purpose? It finds you when you're busy doing the right thing for the right reasons. Frank had never set out to become an inspiration. He'd just wanted to help one struggling kid, but that one act had created a cascade of change that was now touching lives around the globe. The first 5-minute principle workshop was held in the school cafeteria. 50 bus drivers from across the district attended. Frank stood at the front, uncomfortable with the spotlight but determined to share what he'd learned. Marcus sat in the front row, now a junior in high school, taking notes for a documentary he was making for his media class. It's not about breaking rules, Frank explained. It's about remembering why the rules exist in the first place. They're supposed to help us take care of kids, but sometimes the best way to take care of a kid is to wait, to see them, to let them know they matter more than a schedule. The questions came fast. What about liability? What about other parents who complain? What about supervisors who don't understand? Frank had answers for all of them, learned through experience and mistakes and small victories. But his main message was simple. Start with one kid, one moment, one choice to prioritize humanity over efficiency. David shared his perspective as a parent who'd been on the receiving end of that kindness. When you're drowning, he said, his voice steady but emotional, 5 minutes can feel like a lifetime. Frank's patience didn't just help my son get to school. It helped me believe that we could survive, that we weren't alone, that someone cared, whether we made it or not. By the end of the workshop, something had shifted in that room. 50 bus drivers who'd arrived thinking about routes and schedules left, thinking about the kids they served, about the families behind those children, about the power they had to make a difference 5 minutes at a time. 3 years after that first morning when Frank waited an extra 5 minutes, the transformation was complete. But like all real change, it hadn't happened overnight. It had been built one choice at a time, one morning at a time, one act of kindness layered upon another until it became unshakable. Marcus stood at the podium, high school graduation cap slightly crooked on his head, delivering the valedictorian speech. In the audience, Frank and Helen sat in the front row, invited as honored guests. David was there too, tears streaming down his face, healthy and whole and proud beyond measure. 4 years ago, Marcus began, his voice clear and strong, I was a kid who couldn't get to the bus on time. I was drowning in circumstances beyond my control, but a bus driver named Frank Johnson saw me. Not my lateness, not my problems. Me. And he waited. The auditorium was silent. This wasn't a typical graduation speech about reaching for the stars or following your dreams. This was about something deeper. About how we save each other. About how small acts of grace can redirect entire lives. Mr. Frank taught me that heroes don't always save the world. Sometimes they just save one person's world. And sometimes, that's enough to change everything. He waited 5 minutes every morning. 5 minutes that told me I mattered. 5 minutes that kept my dad fighting through his illness. 5 minutes that built a bridge between struggling and thriving. Marcus paused, looking directly at Frank. But here's what I learned. We all have 5 minutes. Every one of us in this room has 5 minutes we could give to someone else. 5 minutes to listen. 5 minutes to help. 5 minutes to show up. The question is, will we use them? You could have heard a pin drop in that auditorium. Parents who'd never heard the full story were wiping their eyes. Students who'd ridden bus 47 were nodding, remembering their own moments of being seen, being waited for, being valued. I'm going to college next year, Marcus continued. Full scholarship to study social work, because Mr. Frank showed me that The most important thing we can do with our lives is help other people find their footing. My dad is here today, healthy and strong, because a bus driver cared enough to check on us. I'm here today because an entire community decided that kindness mattered more than schedules. The standing ovation started before Marcus even finished. It began with the kids from Bus 47, spread to their families, and soon the entire auditorium was on its feet. But Marcus wasn't done. He had one more thing to say. "Mr. Frank, would you please come up here?" Marcus asked, his voice breaking slightly. Frank shook his head, uncomfortable with the attention, but Helen nudged him forward. The crowd parted, as the bus driver who'd changed everything with 5 minutes made his way to the stage. What happened next would be remembered as one of the most powerful moments in the school's history. Marcus hugged Frank, then turned to the audience. "This man saved my life, but more than that, he taught me how to save others. So I want to make a promise here in front of all of you. I promise to spend my life paying forward those 5 minutes. To every struggling kid, to every overwhelmed parent, to every person who just needs someone to wait for them. I promise to be there." The school principal stepped forward with an announcement nobody expected. "The school board has unanimously voted to rename our Transportation Excellence Award. From now on, it will be called the Frank Johnson 5-Minute Award, given annually to the bus driver who best exemplifies patience, kindness, and community care." Frank stood there, overwhelmed, as the auditorium erupted again. But what moved him most was when David joined them on stage. The three of them, a bus driver, a father, and a son, stood together as living proof that kindness creates families in ways biology never could. After the ceremony, as families streamed out into the sunshine, Frank found himself surrounded by former students, kids who were now in college, starting careers, building families of their own. Each one had a story about a moment when he'd made a difference, a day he'd noticed they were struggling, a time he'd asked if they were okay. "You probably don't remember," one young woman said, "but in 6th grade I was being bullied. You noticed I was sitting alone and you assigned me the special job of helping younger kids find their seats. That small thing made me feel valuable, when I thought I was worthless." Another student, now a nurse, shared how Frank had kept snacks on the bus for kids who came to school hungry. "You never made it feel like charity," she said, "just kindness. You taught me that helping people should feel normal, not exceptional." Time has a way of revealing the true impact of our choices. 5 years after that graduation, the 5-minute principle had spread to school districts across the country. What started as one man's decision to wait for a struggling child had become a movement that was reshaping how we think about education, community, and care. Frank, now officially retired from daily driving but still training new drivers, received a letter that would bring his journey full circle. It was from Marcus, now finished with college and working as a social worker. But this wasn't just an update. It was an invitation. "Mr. Frank," the letter read, "I'm writing to tell you about a kid on my caseload. His name is Jamie. He's 7 years old, lives with his grandmother who's struggling with health issues, and he's been missing a lot of school. Sound familiar? I've been working with the family, but I realized something. He doesn't just need a social worker, he needs someone to wait for him, someone to show him he matters. He needs his own Frank Johnson." The letter continued. "I've been volunteering as a bus aide on his route, trying to be for him what you were for me. But I wanted you to know that your 5 minutes are still changing lives. Every day, in every choice I make, I hear your voice reminding me that sometimes the most important thing we can do is slow down and see the human being in front of us. You know what's remarkable about legacy? It's not built in grand gestures or monumental achievements. It's built in daily decisions to prioritize people over policies. It's built in the courage to break rules when those rules prevent us from being human. It's built 5 minutes at a time." Frank shared the letter with Helen over dinner. They sat in the same living room where Marcus had once fallen asleep on their couch, safe and loved. The walls were now covered with photos and letters from the hundreds of lives they'd touched. But it all started with 5 minutes. "Did you ever imagine?" Helen asked, holding his hand across the table. "When you decided to wait that first morning, did you have any idea what would come from it?" Frank shook his head. I just saw a kid who needed help. That's all. I just couldn't drive away. And that's the truth about changing the world. We don't set out to do it. We just set out to help one person, to solve one problem, to wait 5 minutes. But when we choose compassion over convenience, when we choose to see each other as family rather than strangers, when we refuse to leave anyone behind, that's when miracles happen. The next week, Frank visited Jamie's bus stop. He watched from his car as Marcus helped the boy with his backpack, as the bus driver waited patiently, as another cycle of care began. He saw Jamie's grandmother wave from the window, exhausted but grateful. He saw a community in the making. Frank drove home. He thought about all the 5-minute decisions that had led to this moment. His choice to wait. Marcus's father's choice to accept help. Helen's choice to open their home. The community's choice to rally around a struggling family. Each decision had been small, almost insignificant on its own. But together, they had built something beautiful. That evening, Frank received a call from a national news network. They were doing a follow-up story, 5 years later. Where were they now? What had changed? What had lasted? They wanted to know if the 5-minute principle was just a feel-good story, or if it had created real, lasting change. Frank smiled. "Come to my town," he said. "Ride our buses, talk to our kids, visit our schools. See for yourself what 5 minutes can do." Because he knew what they would find. Not perfection, not a fairy tale, but a community that had remembered how to care for each other. A place where no child was left behind, not because of policy, but because of people. The truth is, we all have 5 minutes. The question is, what will we do with them? Will we hurry past the struggles of others, focused on our own schedules and priorities, or will we stop? Will we wait? Will we see the human being in front of us who might just need those 5 minutes to change their entire life? Marcus wrote in his final report for the Jamie case. Progress noted. Child's attendance improving. Family stabilizing. Connection established with school bus driver who demonstrates consistent care and patience. Recommendation: continue current support. Sometimes the best intervention is simply someone who refuses to give up on you. And so the ripples continue. In cities and towns across the country, bus drivers wait an extra minute. Teachers ask why a child is struggling instead of simply marking them absent. Parents look out for each other's children. Communities remember that we're all in this together. All because one morning a bus driver named Frank Johnson looked at a running child and made a decision. He decided that being on time was less important than being kind. He decided that rules should serve people, not the other way around. He decided to wait 5 minutes. Those 5 minutes changed everything, and they're still changing lives today. Because here's the secret: heroes aren't born. They're made in the small moments when we choose patience over frustration, kindness over indifference, love over fear. They're made when we remember that every person we meet is fighting a battle we know nothing about. They're made when we decide that no one gets left behind. You have 5 minutes. What will you do with them? Maybe you'll wait for someone who's running late. Maybe you'll check on a neighbor who seems overwhelmed. Maybe you'll be the stable presence in someone's chaotic world. Maybe you'll be the reason someone believes that kindness still exists. The world needs more Frank Johnsons. The world needs more people who understand that sometimes the most revolutionary thing you can do is simply refuse to leave someone behind. The world needs you to use your 5 minutes. So tomorrow morning, when you're tempted to rush, remember this story. Remember Frank. Remember Marcus. Remember that your 5 minutes might be the difference between someone giving up and someone holding on. Remember that kindness creates ripples you'll never fully see. And remember this: every single day, you have the power to change a life. It doesn't require money or special skills or extraordinary courage. It just requires 5 minutes and a heart that's willing to wait. That's the power of 5 minutes. That's the power of seeing people as family instead of strangers. That's the power of choosing love over efficiency every single time. The bus is waiting. Someone needs you to see them. Someone needs your 5 minutes. What will you do? Like this video if you believe in the power of small acts of kindness. Subscribe to hear more stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things, and share your own 5-minute story in the comments below. This channel is for those who believe that patience, kindness, and community can change the world, 5 minutes at a time.